Jim Stanford is the director of the Centre for Future Work, and he joins me now in the studio. Very good afternoon to you. Let's pick up on what the Minister was saying there about the circumstances facing low-paid workers in Australia. Just how bad is it getting for them?
Oh, he's quite right. We know that inflation has accelerated dramatically since the COVID pandemic, currently running at about 7% a year. Wages, on the other hand, going much, much slower. So what that means is what you can buy with your pay is shrinking year after year, and that's tough for anyone. But for someone who can barely pay for the essentials of life in the first place, that's a disaster. And we are seeing households in Australia that can't buy their groceries and other essentials of life. So it's absolutely essential that lower paid workers at least keep up with inflation.
How difficult is it to achieve that, though? Because there are so many different considerations that go into a decision from the Fair Work Commission. I know the government is not putting a figure on what it says the wages should increase by, but how difficult is it to come to that conclusion and I guess not upset everyone?
Well, certainly the Fair Work Commission will consider a whole range of different factors, including the macroeconomic environment, inflation, of course, and fairness considerations. They have new marching orders, if you like, with the industrial relations reforms from last year. They have to consider things like gender pay equity in their decision as well. But the inflation isn't hard to figure out, Matthew. We heard the minister say absolutely real wages for low-income workers have to be protected. So that is going to have to be something in the range of 7%, because that's where inflation is at. And I think that was a pretty clear, he didn't mention the number, but I think the direction was pretty clear, and he's, I think, in the right direction.
Just on that, the federal government's submission, it does say that it's not suggesting that the only consideration in determining wages across the board should be inflation, nor that it is an automatic increase in wages, but it goes on to say the current economic circumstances are exceptional, challenging and expected to be temporary. Is that effectively putting a number on something without putting a number on it?
He, in a way, echoed what Mr. Albanese said last year during the election campaign, a year ago, when we were doing this same procedure of everyone putting in their claims on minimum wage. Well, we were in the middle of an election, so it was all the more controversial. And at that point, too, Mr. Albanese said, yes, real wages should keep up with inflation. And you know, the opposition, at that time the government, tried to box him in and say that was not legitimate or not sustainable, but the vast majority of Australians agreed. We did some exit polling, actually, after the election. 83% of Australians agreed with the proposition. Minimum wages should at least keep up with inflation, and I suspect that proportion has grown since then.
What do you make of the argument that's put forward by the business sector in particular, that small businesses are going to go to the wall as a result of having to pay these higher wages if indeed they are demanded by the Fair Work Commission?
Well, Matthew, I've been a professional economist for 30 years, and in that time I have not once heard business leaders come out and say, yes, I want to pay higher wages. So, you know, they say this every year. It was actually big business leaders today saying the minimum wage growth should be kept below inflation, which in essence is telling low-income workers you should have a cut in your living standard. And workers are the victims of inflation, not the cause. And when you see the CEOs of these huge companies whose price hikes have actually caused the inflation we're dealing with, begrudge a wage increase for the poorest people in our labour force, frankly, I think it's immoral.
You penned a piece just along those lines actually last month called The Profit Price Spiral, the truth behind Australia's inflation. What is that landscape at the moment when it comes to wages compared to business profits? You
know, a lot of people have kind of dusted off their 1970s economic textbooks, and they see inflation, they automatically think wages and labour markets and labour costs and wage price spiral. The story today is very, very different. It's more like a profit price spiral. Real wages have fallen throughout this inflationary episode. Wages were growing very slow when we went into COVID. And what we have seen is a dramatic increase in profit margins. And this shows that companies have taken advantage of the supply disruptions, the lockdowns, the pent-up consumer demand, the energy price spike that we saw after the war in Ukraine. And they said, look, this is a moment I can sock it to the market and charge whatever the market will bear. So our estimates show about 69% of all the excess inflation above the RBA's 2.5% target since COVID can be traced to higher profit margins in Australia. So they're passing on higher costs, yes, but much more than that. And I think it's important that at least we understand where this problem came from.
It seems like some of the crossbenchers, in particular in the Senate, the Greens are quick to pick up on that profit situation. Not so much the major parties. It doesn't seem like they want to take a bat to the business sector in the same way. Is that a fair assessment?
Well, perhaps. I know everyone has their eye on kind of the politics, but I'll remind you about those polls we did. The vast majority of people would see this as a no-brainer. Yes, people who are struggling to pay the bills at the best of times should at least keep up with inflation. And I think we've seen a change. I saw Mr. Chalmers' comments earlier, Mr. Burke's comments today. I think they're on board with the idea that wages have to be protected. You know, this inflation is not going to last forever. This is clearly the result of unique situations after the pandemic. And in the meantime, low-income workers, low-income households have to be protected. And a minimum wage increase is an obvious way to do that.
Jim Stanford, I'm going to ask you to do a little bit of crystal ball gazing here. We have seen the latest inflation figures. It doesn't look like it is coming off a little bit from those highs that we saw in the previous month. Do you think we've hit that peak and there's going to be some relief to come?
I think there will be, yes. I think the inflation rate will come down over the coming year. Most of those initial problems that caused the post-COVID price rises, supply chain disruptions, remember the ports had giant lineups of ships when we were reopening, the energy price shock, those are all starting to get fixed, and I think we will see moderation. But in the meantime, we have to make sure workers are protected for now. And low-income workers have already experienced big real wage losses in the last 2 years by at least 5%. They saw their real purchasing power decline. So the fact that the inflation rate has come down should not mean, therefore, we don't need a significant minimum wage increase. We absolutely do.
Well, Dr. Jim Stanford, for your views this afternoon. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Matthew.